Mustafa Qadri, founder of Equidem Research and Consulting and Equidem, the charity. Thank you so much for joining me. I know your charity just conducted an extensive report about labor rights in the GCC. Obviously, there's been quite a bit written about this subject generally, but you wanted to focus on how COVID had an impact. What did you set out to prove? What were you surprised by?
We spoke to over 200 workers in Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, which doesn't seem like a large number, but these were one-on-one interviews in detail, confidentially done, not in a group setting. And we think that it's a relatively representative sample of the wider situation. So we think that the workers that we spoke to represent about hundreds of thousands of different workers, women and men, across a range of sectors: oil and gas, hospitality, infrastructure, construction, transportation, the whole gamut of different sectors which are essential to the economy of the Gulf. And what they painted was a really harrowing picture of not just suffering, but complete neglect. And what that means in practice is that when the pandemic hits the region, these three countries changed their law so that if you are a non-national, and it mostly really applied to low-wage workers who are migrant workers, that it was lawful for your employer to drastically reduce your pay or put you on unpaid leave. Now, the law in each three countries said that you had to get the consent of the worker. But in reality, what we found was workers were being forced to sign documentation, and they were in no position to really bargain. And that when governments and businesses were, we presume, negotiating amongst themselves in terms of the economic impact of the pandemic and working out the deals to protect them, whilst there were packages provided in all three countries, and Qatar had the most robust system for that of the three countries, but it did not seem to really get down to the ground level.
When we look at these three countries specifically, Qatar and Saudi Arabia both introduced provisions where you could change jobs, making that a bit more easy in the past few months. The United Arab Emirates has done its fair share of trying to free up labor markets. Have these things had any impact? Are they in any way a response to the situation that we saw over this COVID period?
I think that's a really good question. I think there's two aspects to that. One is to say that these are positive changes, that we've seen that on the ground, that there has been a period of about 10 years of labor reform, and these are positive things. I think Qatar is probably ahead of the pack in terms of engaging with the international community to find, solutions, working directly with the International Labour Organization. We see that in different respects, we find the labor market in these three countries is slightly ahead of the other. So for example, there are aspects of the UAE labor market which is much more mature in terms of handling issues than, say, the Qatari market. In Saudi Arabia, often the labor complaints system, the way that recruiters back in workers' countries of origin can complain about things, is more sophisticated. But what we've seen is that it's a mixture of both. This is a huge crisis, the corona pandemic, that everyone is struggling with, and these countries are no different. At the same time, that these reforms are happening while they've also weakened labor protections that have benefited employers, that when they have financial impacts, there's very little pressure on them to make sure that the lowest rung of their workforce, whether directly employed or in the supply chain, are looked after. So in short, those reforms are positive. I don't think it's too simplistic to say that, it's not enough, because what you're dealing with the pandemic is a new situation. But what it does remind us is there's something deeper than just kafala reform, the sponsorship system. It has to be about the fact that this is an inherently discriminatory labor market, and that also workers can't join or form a union. The third thing also, which I didn't mention before, is that workers simply cannot become nationals. They can't become recognized as part of the society if they've worked there for 18 years, 15 years. And that is an inherently discriminatory situation.
What responsibility do businesses have generally to push for change from the government level, from their peers in the region?
In terms of what the concrete things are, well, in the immediate sense, actually, there's a very simple thing that businesses can do, which is that if there are protections to employees, to workers provided under the law, under government or state-run schemes, applied in a non-discriminatory way. Don't apply a different rule for nationals or white collar workers to the standard that you apply to other types of workers. And that's a really important point, because particularly if you're an international business in the Gulf, because of the changes to the law, because of the pandemic, you may actually currently be guilty of racial discrimination, even if you did not intend to do that. So one really simple thing is apply the same standards to everyone, regardless of who they are. The second thing is that we do recognize there is a financial impact because of the pandemic, but those things need to be clearly explained, and there needs to be some transitioning if there is, for example, a change towards, reducing the size of your workforce, or there are financial or other problems that you as a business are facing. And we would argue that a key part of that is having to work with trade unions and having some collective representation systems, not just for your direct employees, but for worker communities. And because if you don't have that, you're dealing with millions of workers. And we know for a fact, and I'm sure many of your viewers will know, that in the absence of those kind of formal mechanisms, workers then strike. They'll go to the head office of a building, and that causes a lot of delay. So apart from the human rights and the moral aspects to it, which are important, purely on a pragmatic level, that causes lots of issues. So I think those are some really immediate things that can be looked at. And I think also that if you speak to workers, a lot of the issues are around an absence of understanding where they stand, an absence of understanding that, here's our situation as a business, things have to change. And if you go back to your home country, we may have to get you back to your country straight away, but here's a system for you to, make a claim for any wages we haven't paid you yet, or ask any questions about how things will be in the future and whether you have a job. Here's a way that your loved ones back home can actually get in touch with the company, the management, to ask any questions they might have about their relatives who might be in a quarantine facility because that they've caught corona and we can't access them. So these are actually things that off the shelf there are solutions to.